The forgotten workers who built Las Vegas in the desert. What if the city the world associates with neon, jackpots, and luxury was really built by men dangling on ropes 500 feet above a river? By laborers breathing 140-degree tunnel air, and by families pushed into tents because the model town nearby would not let them through the gate? Imagine crossing the Las Vegas Strip today without realizing that before the lights, before the casinos, before the spectacle, there were jobless migrants, segregated work crews, blasted canyon walls, and a desert city so close to collapse that many thought it would simply dry up and disappear. To understand Las Vegas, you have to see what really happened in the years when the desert demanded blood before it gave back power, water, and wealth. The forgotten workers who built Las Vegas in the desert. What if the city the world associates with neon, jackpots, and luxury was really built by men dangling on ropes 500 feet above a river, by laborers breathing 140-degree tunnel air, and by families pushed into tents because the model town nearby would not let them through the gate? Imagine crossing the Las Vegas Strip today without realizing that before the lights, before the casinos, before the spectacle, there were jobless migrants, segregated work crews, blasted canyon walls, and a desert city so close to collapse that many thought it would simply dry up and disappear. To understand Las Vegas, you have to see what really happened in the years when the desert demanded blood before it gave back power, water, and wealth. The scale of that promise was almost impossible to grasp. On March 4th, 1931, the Bureau of Reclamation opened bids for construction. On March 11th, it awarded the contract to 6 companies. A consortium formed because no single firm wanted to shoulder the project's staggering risk and its $5 million performance bond alone. Frank Crowe, the famed construction superintendent later nicknamed Hurry Up Crowe, helped shape the winning bid. $48,890,995, just $24,000 below the government's own estimate. In an era of breadlines and collapse, that number sounded like salvation. And people came. They came by rail. They came by road. They came because there was nowhere else to go. Between the fall of 1930 and the spring of 1931 alone, PBS reports that 42,000 unemployed workers descended on Las Vegas, hoping to land one of roughly 5,000 jobs connected to the dam. Picture the scene. Dust blowing off the valley floor, cheap camps and auto courts filling up, men scanning for any hiring rumor, women trying to keep children fed, everyone staring toward Black Canyon as if the future itself were hidden in the rock. But the future was not hiring 42,000 people. It was choosing a fraction and leaving the rest to improvise survival in a hostile landscape. Before there was Boulder City, many of the lucky men who did get hired ended up in a raw settlement known as Ragtown. The name tells you almost everything. Isla Clements Davy, the daughter of a dam worker, remembered it in stark terms. There was just nothing. There was no facility. Nothing. There was nothing green around here. Everything was baked, hot, and brown. That is the landscape beneath the Hoover Dam legend. Not cinematic heroism first, but thirst, dirt, canvas, scrap lumber, and the constant abrasion of wind over barren ground. But the real challenge was still ahead. The dam site itself was a place of extremes. Before the first major concrete pour, before the finished arch would rise 726 feet high and 660 feet thick at the base, the river had to be controlled and the canyon had to be made ready. That meant roads, temporary bridges, camps, drills, cableways, rail lines, spoil dumps, and above all, labor. Hard labor. Dangerous labor. Often anonymous labor. One of the least glamorous but most essential pieces of the project was transportation. The materials that made Hoover Dam possible did not float into Black Canyon by miracle. They arrived through a carefully built logistics system linking Las Vegas to Boulder City and then to the canyon rim. According to the Library of Congress HER report, the U.S. Construction Railroad formed the final rail link from the Las Vegas Connected Network to the dam site. Construction on this railroad began on March 1st, 1931, and it was ready for operation by the first week of September 1931. The line stretched 10.28 miles, descending from about 2,500 feet above sea level at summit to around 1,390 feet near Black Canyon. with 5 tunnels ranging from 165 to 415 feet long. Building it required excavation of 380,000 cubic yards of loose earth and gravel, 280,000 cubic yards of rock for the roadbed, and the hauling of about 2 million cubic yards of material for fills. The workforce building that railroad fluctuated between 125 and 300 men working in 2 daily shifts. Those numbers matter because they reveal a hidden truth. Las Vegas was not simply saved by a dam. It was reorganized by a supply chain. Cement, steel, machinery, pipe, food, and men moved through this desert system with military precision. The railroad hauled freight. Workers were often trucked in from Boulder City. Heavy equipment could be lowered hundreds of feet by cableway. Las Vegas became the gateway because thousands of people and millions of pounds of material had to pass through it. The city's later growth was not just ideological or cultural. It was logistical. Then came the canyon walls. To build the dam, the Colorado River first had to be diverted through 4 tunnels, 2 on each side of Black Canyon. Official Bureau of Reclamation history gives the dimensions plainly. For 56-foot diameter tunnels, with a combined length of nearly 16,000 feet, more than 3 miles. Tunneling began in May 1931. At first, there were no proper roads into the canyon, so workers and equipment had to be brought in by boat. Imagine that. The most important public works project in the country beginning with boats, ropes, and improvised access in a canyon that could scorch you in summer and freeze you in winter. Inside those tunnels, the air became a punishment. Summer temperatures in the workings reached 140 degrees Fahrenheit. Workers used pneumatic drills. The project purchased 500 pneumatic drills, hoses, and compressors. To speed the work, crews mounted a drilling jumbo on the back of a 10-ton truck, allowing 24 to 30 drills to work at once across a tunnel face. A ton of dynamite was used for every 14 feet of tunnel dug. After blasting, crews moved in with power shovels and hand tools to clear muck and shattered stone. Ultimately, more than 1,500,000 cubic yards of spoil were removed from the tunnels. It was a world of machine roar, grit in the mouth, and powder smoke hanging in the dark. How did men endure that without modern ventilation, modern protective culture, or real bargaining power? Because the Depression did not leave them many choices. Why November 14th, 1932, the river was finally diverted around the site. But controlling the Colorado did not mean conquering nature once and for all. In September 1932, floodwaters swept through the canyon and forced evacuation. This was human versus nature in its rawest form. Men trying to impose order on a river system that had already reshaped the West and, in earlier decades, broken into. California's Imperial Valley with catastrophic effect. If the tunnel crews fought the canyon from within, the high-scalers fought it from the outside. Their job was to descend the canyon walls on ropes and strip away loose rock with jackhammers, crowbars, and dynamite before construction could safely proceed. The Bureau of Reclamation describes them as men from many backgrounds: former sailors, circus acrobats, American Indians, agile enough to swing over empty space on slender lines. They carried tools and water bags as they moved across the cliff face. The jackhammers alone weighed 44 pounds. There is something almost absurd about that image. One man hanging above the Colorado, one hand on a rope, one hand trying to control a pounding metal tool against a vertical wall of rock. The danger was constant. Air hoses and electrical lines tangled across the cliffs. Drills steel hung in bunches. Rocks and tools could drop without warning. The Bureau notes that the most common cause of death during dam construction was being struck by falling objects. In response, workers improvised their own protection, coating cloth hats with coal tar to create crude but effective hard-boiled hats, before commercially made hard hats were issued more broadly. No harnis culture, no second chances, no guarantee you would be seen if you fell. And yet these men developed their own code, their own swagger. Some performed stunts when foremen were not looking, swinging out from the cliffs to entertain workers below. Bureau of Reclamation history singles out Lewis, the human pendulum, Fagan, who for weeks ferried fellow workers around a projecting boulder by wrapping a man to his body and leaping into the air. It sounds impossible until you remember this project repeatedly demanded the impossible. Another official story tells of a bureau engineer, Burl R. Rutledge, slipping from a rim, only to have high scaler Oliver Cowan seize his leg mid-fall, while Arnold Parks swung over to pin his body to the wall until a safety line could be dropped. What kind of reflexes, what kind of nerve, what kind of daily proximity to death produces men who can do that? But behind the spectacle, a different story was unfolding. The men who worked inside the system were controlled by a system that valued schedule above comfort and too often above safety. Six Companies was efficient, disciplined, and profit-minded. Frank Crow's reputation for speed became legend. PBS notes that by 1933, Six Companies was 2 years ahead of schedule and had reported a $3 million profit. That pace impressed the nation. It also increased the pressure on crews already operating in brutal conditions. Workers pushed back. On August 7, 1931, after 30 tunnel workers were reassigned to lower-paying jobs, fellow tunnel crews struck. By the next day, according to the Nevada database, the walkout had grown to around 1,400 workers, most of them tunnel men. Their demands were specific: a minimum wage of $5 a day, $5.50 for tunnel workers, and $6 for miners and carpenters, sanitary improvements, clean ice water, an 8-hour day, $1.50 a day housing, and a safety miner stationed at tunnel entrances for quick first aid. It was not radical fantasy. It was a survival document. Frank Crow rejected all of it. Public officials hurried to the scene. Federal authorities made clear that troops would be available if violence erupted. The message was unmistakable. This project would not be stopped by labor. Within a week, the strike collapsed. Some improvements came later. More lighting, more ice water stations, faster housing construction, but the broader lesson remained brutal. In Depression America, a worker on a marquee federal project could still be replaceable within hours. While executives calculated deadlines and margins, laborers calculated whether they could afford to lose a paycheck for even a few days. And then there was the official town. By 1932, conditions for many workers improved compared with Ragtown because Boulder City neared completion. Officially, it was a model community. In practice, it was also a tightly controlled reservation of labor. PBS describes large dormitories for single men, cottages for families, and a giant mess hall serving 6,000 meals a day. Every week, the town consumed 12 tons of fruit and vegetables, 5 tons of meat, and 2.5 tons of eggs. For $1.50 a day, a man got 3 all-you-can-eat meals. That sounds generous until you remember why the system had to feed so many people so efficiently. Because it had built a machine for labor extraction in the desert. The town's gate told the rest of the story. There were rules. Gambling, drinking, and prostitution, the very freedoms and temptations associated with Las Vegas down the road, were banned. Overseeing the place was Sims Ely, a 69-year-old former newspaper editor and Justice Department employee whom PBS describes as holding legal, moral, and judicial authority. Mary and Merrill remembered him as a hard man who ran the town by his own rules. This was not only a housing project. It was social engineering under federal oversight, and the exclusions were built into the design. African American, Native American, and Hispanic dam workers were not allowed to live within Boulder City's gates, even though they helped build the project the town existed to serve. The hospital, underwritten by Six Companies, opened in 1932, but it primarily served workers, not their spouses and children. Schools were makeshift because the government provided no formal funding for a real education system. So even inside the model settlement, the comforts were limited and conditional. Outside it, they could vanish altogether. For black workers and black families, the story was harsher still. This is where the phrase "forgotten workers" becomes more than a sentimental label. It becomes an indictment. In May 1931, the Colored Citizens Labor and Protective Association of Las Vegas complained that none of the first 1,000 workers hired by Six Companies were African American. PBS reports that company officials defended the exclusion by claiming black workers might cause racial strife on white crews. Under pressure, 6 companies' president W.A. Bechtel promised to increase black hiring, but the results remained shamefully small. By 1933, there were only 24 African-American workers in a workforce of 4,000 men. Across the whole 1931 to 1935 construction era, City of Las Vegas and NAACP Las Vegas sources say only about 44 black workers out of roughly 20,000 hired found work on the dam. Those men were not merely underrepresented. They were segregated in labor and in life. PBS notes that black workers were relegated to the Arizona gravel pits, described as the hottest part of the job site. They traveled on segregated buses, rode a rough 30-mile route to work, returned at night to the slums and makeshift settlements of West Las Vegas, and were forced to drink from separate water buckets on the job. So ask yourself, what does it mean to help build the infrastructure of modern Las Vegas while being denied entry into the spaces your labor is making possible? This exclusion had lasting geographic consequences. The City of Las Vegas West Side timeline explains that as black residents arrived in southern Nevada seeking Hoover Dam work, they were denied both jobs and access to Boulder City. As a result, African Americans began establishing tent housing on the west side, where a larger community took shape. In other words, one of the foundational black neighborhoods in Las Vegas grew directly out of federal labor exclusion. The glittering city did not merely forget these workers later. It helped marginalize them while they were still doing the work. The people who resisted that injustice deserve names. Arthur McCants, president of NAACP Las Vegas, branch number 1111, was among the local leaders who challenged the discrimination. Zimmy Turner helped organize alongside him. J.P. Liddell led the Colored Citizens Labor Protective Association. National NAACP Field Secretary William Pickens also became involved, pressing the issue during a 1932 visit. They did not suddenly transform the project into a fair workplace, but they established a pattern of black political resistance in southern Nevada, one that later fed into battles over strip employment and civil rights. What happened next would change everything. With the river diverted and the foundation excavated, the project entered its most iconic phase. First concrete was placed on June 6, 1933. By December 5, 1934, workers were celebrating the astonishing pace of the pour after placing 3 million cubic yards of concrete in just 18 months, according to PBS's image archive. The Bureau's official chronology records that water began backing up into what would become Lake Mead on February 1, 1935, and the last concrete was placed on May 29, 1935. President Franklin D. Roosevelt dedicated the dam on September 30, 1935. The engineering remained extraordinary right to the end. The concrete had to be poured in interlocking blocks rather than one single mass. The Bureau explains that each block was 5 feet high, with concrete delivered in 8 cubic yard buckets. Men known as puddlers vibrated and stamped the wet concrete to remove air pockets. This detail matters for another reason. It destroys one of the most persistent myths about the dam. No one is buried in Hoover Dam. The Bureau's official essay is explicit on that point. But myth often grows where grief is real. The question of how many died building the dam remains contested because different counts include different categories. The official Bureau of Reclamation figure is 96 industrial fatalities, men who died at the dam site from causes like blasting, falling rock, slides, falls, or accidents with heavy equipment. PBS and some other narratives use 112, a broader total that includes other project-related deaths outside the strict industrial definition. The contradiction matters because it reveals how institutions count suffering. If a man collapses from heat or dies after being removed from the job site, does the official number remember him? And the names behind those numbers still surface in official records. M.J. Sidmore, a 37-year-old miner, was killed in a premature tunnel blast on December 15, 1931. Frank Manning, also 37, died the next morning from his fractured skull. A.O. George, a mechanic, was crushed between trucks on March 11, 1932. His first shift, only 35 minutes after he started. Howard Cornelius, 23, died in January 1933 after a shovel struck a missed hole in tunnel number 2. Gus Enberg, 36, died after a primer explosion tore through his body on January 10, 1933. These are not abstractions. These are men with ages, relatives, funeral homes, and unfinished futures. By the time the final pour was completed, Hoover Dam had become one of the great monuments of the industrial age. It rose 726 feet above the river. The dam and related works used roughly 4.5 million cubic yards of concrete, according to Bureau Educational Materials. Electricity from its generators would spread across the Southwest through 2,700 miles of transmission lines. Las Vegas, which now gets almost all of its water from Lake Mead, would never be the same. Nearly a century later, that is the paradox still standing in concrete. Las Vegas is usually narrated through the language of reinvention. Gambling legalized again in 1931, tourism, vice, spectacle, the Strip, the post-war boom. All of that is true, but it sits on an earlier truth. The city's first great modern growth spurt came because federal money, dam labor, road building, power distribution, and water control transformed southern Nevada from precarious outpost to strategic node. Yet for the men who actually built that future, the rewards were uneven. Some found wages, meals, in a town in Boulder City. Others found only Ragtown. Some were celebrated as daring high-scalers. Others vanished into payroll statistics. Black workers fought for access and were met with token hiring, segregation, and forced displacement into the West Side. Families improvised community where official community excluded them. Laborers risked their lives so executives and politicians could point to a triumph of modern America. The achievement was real. So was the hierarchy that organized it. So when you look at Las Vegas today, at the fountains, the towers, the cold air pouring across casino floors, the impossible green against the desert, you're also looking at the afterlife of blast crews, tunnel men, railroad graders, mess hall workers, truck drivers, high-scalers, and excluded families who were told to build history without expecting to belong fully inside it. You're looking at a city powered by water held back in Lake Mead, a reservoir made possible by men who worked through 140-degree tunnel heat and across canyon walls where drop tools could kill. You're looking at a place whose growth cannot be separated from federal engineering, labor discipline, and racial exclusion. Hoover Dam still stands today, built on extraordinary human effort and undeniable human cost. As modern Las Vegas continues to market wonder in the middle of the Mojave, this story reminds us that cities do not emerge from myth. They are built by workers, named and unnamed, remembered and forgotten, included and excluded. The question now is, when you see Las Vegas, do you see only the lights, or do you see the men on the ropes, the tents in the dust, the segregated buses, and the concrete poured day and night to make the desert obey? Share your thoughts below.